Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning to anyone joining in the US. And yeah, thanks for saving the time to join our webinar on deep positioning. To sort of set the scene, just as a few people are joining, Mike published the first version of the pharmaceutical positioning book in, I think it was 2021. We probably started working on it in 2020. And we have the second edition coming up in the coming weeks. So we're kind of very excited to share that new work with everyone. And we wanted to take the time to talk through what's going to be in the second edition of the book. Also to take questions from anyone on the webinar and anyone who read the first book. I've had a few questions sent to me already, so I'll be posting them once Mike's started his kind of presentation. On Livestorm, we've got a questions and a chat function, and both should be enabled. So yeah, if anyone in the audience has questions or wants to pop us any messages, please use and keep an eye on the questions and chat functions. We've got about 30 minutes scheduled, and this recording also gets shared around for anyone who wasn't able to join live. So at this point, I'll hand over to Mike, and yeah, look forward to hearing the conversation.
Thanks, Theo. And for any of you, because I can't see anybody, all I can see is Theo and myself. So please do use the chat function. I was hoping to get as many questions from you as I could. And as Theo says, the inspiration for the first book was that there isn't one. There's a book on positioning, but there wasn't a book on positioning pharmaceuticals. So we used the benefit of our experience over a long time to say what works and what doesn't. Not everyone loved it because it was mostly cartoons with some accompanying text about the philosophy of positioning rather than the how-to of positioning. And there was that one-star review on Amazon that really bugged me. So I felt we should begin to update that, put a little bit more how into the why. But at the same time, we started to really focus on what's one of the biggest issues in pharma is that the word positioning is used by everybody as if it means the same thing, and clearly it doesn't. So I'm going to talk quickly about what I mean about deep positioning and probably what you can expect in the book. I'm not going to cover the whole thing for obvious reasons, but please do be aware that if you like reading, there's a lot more for you in this book than we've had before. So if I can figure Livestorm out, essentially deep positioning challenges that view that was started a long time ago by the recent Trout book on positioning, and they were ad guys, right? So they were ad guys. They focused on what I call brand positioning. The problem is brand positioning is often a wrapper around actually the product itself, and this idea of deep positioning is that it should be the thing that ends up in your label. We've talked about the draft label essentially, or the label itself essentially being your best positioning template. It's got your who, it's got your what, it's got your why, it's got all the things that you would want in a positioning template. So the idea of a label being your positioning template, and therefore the draft label being your way to see this. So I want you to keep this in mind. Deep positioning is about the product. Brand positioning is really what can come later. So let's begin to ask some questions the way that we always did about positioning. And this is one of the key ones. You know, what is the difference between your molecule that's in phase 1 and the same molecule when it hits the market? And the PDF here won't let me build, but essentially it's a trick question. The molecules are the same thing. All you're doing from the day you put it into the lab to the day you put it on the market is the decisions that you make and the evidence that you choose to collect. Now, clearly, you are the variable in a situation like that. The decisions that you make should be based on where you want to take the drug to, and the evidence that you choose to collect should be a result of those decisions. So the process of developing your molecule as a solution to a problem is positioning. So, but here I'm going to refer to that as deep positioning because not everyone understands that word. finding a position in the market that your product can occupy is deep positioning. The person who makes those market positioning decisions is positioning your drug. Now, in most pharmaceutical companies, of course, that's not necessarily the commercial people, but let's carry on and focus on that. And the origin of some of this sort of challenge is that, we spend so much time worrying about the molecule, but clearly, as a case study that like this one shows, same drug, 5 different companies, essentially interchangeable checkpoint inhibitors, ends up delivering either $70 billion in revenue or almost none, depending on who you are and what decisions you made next to that. There is no argument that says that the molecules were the difference here. The difference in performance here is only explainable by looking at the decision making that led to them. So here's another question that we keep posing to pharma companies, and we haven't had a good answer to this from anybody yet, whether it's head of R&D, CEO of biotech, who puts the target and the target product profile. And if the assumption is that market should do that, the understanding of unmet needs should really provide that target for the product to develop against, that's not often what we find, and you'll probably all recognize this in your organizations. The decision what to develop has been taken out of the hands of the people who it's going to matter to in the future. So let's come back to that thing about the book 50 years ago. Essentially, Recent began with a series of articles and then a book. And what they said was positioning is what happens in the mind of the customer. And according to them, positioning is not what you do to a product, it's what you do to the mind of the prospect. Now, I think them using the word prospect tells you something about their orientation as a couple of advertising guys, incredibly brilliant advertising guys. But in our world, in pharmaceutical positioning, it is what you do to the product, and then what you do to the mind of the customer, if that's the way that you choose to understand them. So we avoid this kind of challenge where, mostly what we see in portfolio positioning or in positioning when we get to review other people's work is, everyone's got the drug of choice, everyone's got a best-in-class balance of efficacy and safety, and then there's some good stuff that results from that. And everyone's positioning looks the same. Well, there's a reason for that. It's because people aren't understanding their positioning properly. So what's missing from that philosophy is clear. Deep positioning is what comes before there's a product. Whoever decided to turn a molecule into a product, which means indication, this dose, the formulation, the endpoints, and so forth, they're positioning your drug. They're making choices next to what your product becomes that is a deep positioning exercise. So in that old model, it's only in the mind of the prospect, you're going to be positioned by R&D, and then it's going to be tossed over to the marketers to polish the perception of the customer. So you're sort of accepting unmet need is something that is only going to have to live within that very narrow boundary that you've been given. But if you're like us, you believe that baking differentiation into the product is the responsibility of the people responsible for positioning, then that really is that's part of this philosophy. And I think we're all aware that the earlier you involve market access, the earlier you involve the kind of commercial forecasting group, the more interesting this clinical development plan can be. So what is deep positioning? It's the discipline of finding a market position. And therefore, it doesn't matter what else it shows up as, it's about optimizing decision making. So if your drug is ever to be on the market, this matters. And most processes that we look at assume that you can do that later, but you can't. Your room for maneuver will be limited or empowered by whoever chose your market position for you. And because of path dependence, this idea that you've limited the path that you can then collect evidence within, the choices that are made early limit the choices that are available to those who have to pick it up further down the line. That might be your clinical development colleagues in phase 3. It might be your regulatory colleagues who are determining what can go on the label, who might have wanted an input into how to collect it. Your market access colleagues may not be very grateful that you didn't put any value endpoints into the development plan. So deep positioning is what we would all understand as choosing a position and then making your drug fit that position. And clearly there's more than one position that's available. So we want to sort of pay respect to that. Now the book includes some tips. And one of the tips is that instead of a positioning statement starting with drug X is that we simply write drug X will become. And the reason for that is written here. You're positioning for the future, not now. One of the challenges we hear a lot is we don't have those data, therefore we can't say that. And of course, that's not the task of positioning. Choosing a position for the future is it means that we allow our product to become something that it isn't today. Positioning for the data that you could collect, not the data that you already have. So again, just that simple word, product X will become, allows you to say, this is the kind of data that we would choose to collect if we had the choice. It then allows you to use an active framing, not just a passive voice. It's not just based on what you've already collected. And it doesn't really matter which positioning template you use, as long as you focus on the to be, not on the as is. And of course, a lot of the processes that are oriented against the as is, these are the data that we have. This is the nicest way to take it to our customers. That becomes part of the problem. So at the top of any template you choose, and we're less bothered as long as it's not something as terrible as premise, promise, proof. Whatever template you have, write product X will become, and suddenly everything gets easier from that point onwards. Then it's real positioning. It's positioning for the future that you want. And at the core of this, deep positioning is essentially a choice of what you want your product to become. So it's easier to include that simple starting point as we go through. Now I'll run through, and Kristen, thank you for your question. I'll come back to some of these questions at the end, if that's okay, because I think there's a couple of slides that might address these. The book's organized in chapters. One of the ideas that's really important for early phase positioning or deep positioning is who listens to the customer. And one of the challenges that's often presented downstream is that, our voice isn't getting through, people aren't listening. And in many cases, people think you can shout louder to make that happen, right? But if your voice isn't getting through, it might be possible that the noise isn't the problem. What I think is an important reframing of this is to discuss the idea of share of ear instead of share of voice. The more that you get to listen to your customer, and that might not just be the patient, the more you get to listen to that customer, the more you can influence the product that you choose to develop. Knowing that your message needs to be relevant, the predominant idea is to listen and hear the customer. And imagine that you get to hear what they want to say a day sooner than your competition does. That becomes a point of differentiation, a competitive advantage for you, is who's heard what they really want instead of just going out and started shouting at them. Another piece in the book really focuses on what we talk about when we say the word meaningful. And a lot of words float around our industry like significance, statistical significance, clinically relevant information, and so forth. But it's important to remember the significant in the phrase significance only means probably true. It doesn't mean meaningful. And unpacking that is important because we need something that is meaningful to people when they hear it. So this idea of sort of searching for meaning is potentially, let's look at endpoints. So as the cartoon shows here, there's a lot of heart failure drugs have done exactly the same endpoint as everybody else. They've done this 6-minute walk test. And it's hard to differentiate even statistically on that. But if your drug does something that isn't just an effect on the 6-minute walk test, the question is, was there something that you could have understood about that population that you could have studied within this population? So understanding what meaningful is, and then unpacking that a little bit, like we've seen, like the minimal meaningful difference in Alzheimer's that everyone's agreed before this year is higher than lecanemab has shown in its studies. You start to see a measure of the problem. You have curves that have separated. Everyone's arguing about whether this is a slowing of disease or not. But actually, the slowing of disease that we've seen is less than what everyone agreed was a meaningful difference. The difference that you might see on a day-to-day variation in a single patient. So that becomes an important part of deep positioning too. Something that's fundamental to deep positioning is the idea of the value proposition. The value proposition has been pulled towards pricing and market access, which is not really where it should sit. The value proposition essentially is interchangeable with deep positioning in the first place, because it connects the academic world of discovery with real users of medicines. And drugs are moved through pipelines because they can bring value to the lives of patients or healthcare providers. So what are the arguments that would stop value proposition displacing positioning? It's why we've coined the term deep positioning, is because I think these two things are interchangeable. So being able to articulate what the point of the product you're developing should become as inarguable as making sure it's safe. And if you occupy that place in reality, if you've measured your drug more interestingly than your competition, good things can happen, and then it's much easier to occupy that place in your customer's mind. One of the chapters in the book is one of the more controversial ones, which is this idea that we're reliant on false world data, and we're taking that false world data to real world people. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's undeniable that the studies that we rely upon happen in a very sterile clinical environment that doesn't represent the real world. But we take the data from that setting and then try and communicate it and release it into the real world of people with patients sitting in front of them, and choices and economics and all kinds of other things. So if our task in finding a market position is to find a place in the real world, we have to reflect that real world back into our false world studies and be aware that the best we can do is to simulate it or emulate it or understand it. So the place in the mind of the customer has to be a place that's firmly embedded in their real world, the real, messy, imperfect diagnoses, direct and indirect competitors, and so forth, and reinforces almost more than anything else. We shouldn't just be talking about messaging as if it was positioning. The task of creating products that people want and can use really becomes a fundamental component of this. And our task, as we've seen in a lot of pharmaceutical launches recently, there's a lot of approvals happening and people are not then going on to write prescriptions for them. That doesn't help anybody if we continue to do that. So we need to be mindful that we need to be thinking not just of real world evidence in the classic definition, but how can we make our studies as relevant to our real world customer as possible. And this, of course, impinges on who gets to make the choices about the target product profile, and if we're positioning for the real world, we need to provide a direction for development. We need to tell them which data to collect. We need to decide what you want to be able to claim in the future. So the classic brand positioning can only ever reflect this false world view. We're only ever packaging and wrapping a gift that someone else gave us. So I think we all want to move towards what we would call active positioning, which is actively framing your drug. And in the book, I do talk about analogy, metaphor, talk about the role of simulation, emulation, and a lot more when it comes to how we choose some words here. And where are some questions coming through? So I'll try and skip through the last couple of slides. The book also talks about the difference between a product and a molecule. I think we end up talking about molecules as if they're products, but it is now and will become increasingly apparent. The molecule's fixed, but we can make all kinds of decisions on regimen, on device, on companion diagnostics, and so forth, all of which are recognized as products in our day-to-day lives. And there's a massive opportunity to make our drugs more effective simply by altering some of those parameters. And it's a huge opportunity for our business to think about this stuff as much as it thinks about molecules and the biology that sits next to them. So another chapter in this real world positioning is that we need to focus on getting away from the classic clinical trial endpoints that are really easy for us to get distracted by. So if you hear someone talking about OS, patients do not experience overall survival. It's one of the great bugbears, and we tend to talk about the median effect as if it was the effect that an average patient would see, and of course that's not what happens. And it's easy for us to get dragged into seeing our data the way that the regulators and statisticians have to. I mean, they have to do it that way. We don't have to. To prove that a drug has worked is clearly critical. It doesn't mean it's the default way for you to communicate, because our customers see individual patients, and those individual people make individual decisions. They're not choosing for 500 or 5,000. They may only see 1 or 2 of the patients that you're interested in any given year. So let's continue to get away from this idea that the average is understood by everybody. And I will pick up TH's question. This rational customer is addressed in the book. The difference between whether it's actually irrational or whether it's rational to behave as humans is really important. There is a chapter in the book, Thomas, on emotion, what's perceived as emotional positioning and what's not. And we sort of unpack this and get into, well, actually, what's a motivation? What would be a kind of cause for people to begin to think differently about the choice? But actually, this is all possible for us to understand this before we start the development. So rather than try and persuade someone as we get into it, and actually, I might even talk about it here. So one of the chapters in the book to this point talks about talking a different language. So, if I assert something or I try and persuade you of something, those are 2 ways of communicating. A lot of pharma spends its time trying to assert its advantage rather than persuade you of it. If I've persuaded you that my drug is best in class, I've done the work that I set out to do. If I just tell you that it is, you're at liberty to choose to believe me or not. And I think this is where we get into some of those motivations. And the more we understand their real world, the more we understand their motivations, the better this can be. But that point comes down to another chapter in the book about forecasting opportunity, which is part of the task of commercial and deep positioning, which is to say, well, what's the opportunity to do this well? And that kind of classic error of assuming that companies were wrong to turn down the Beatles. Well, there's a lot of work left to do once you pick them up. When they were just a covers band at the time that they were being turned down by all the other labels. So, deep positioning is looking in places that others are not looking, or looking at the same places differently, but also being aware that you're understanding the variables and the invariables, be part of the conversation about how the product is developed. Your task is to be the manager of a band rather than just to say, yes, you're ready for prime time or you're not. You're developing the product for that marketplace. And that is part of the opportunity and the asymmetry that we see in this space. And here's something that becomes even more important as you get into spaces like cell therapy, gene therapy, rare disease therapies. I used the idea of phase transition in 2 different ways. One is that you have to displace something. And if you're going to persuade me and what I'm doing today is wrong, and I'm going to have to do something different, what it might mean is that I'm going to have to give you to a different customer. I'm going to have to give you to my colleague instead of keeping you for myself. I'm going to have to learn something I didn't know how to do before. I'm going to have to navigate a challenge financially that I've never had to deal with before. I'm going to have a team that I didn't have before. If we forget about any of that when we're thinking about launching a product, we're already in the wrong place. So the idea of deep positioning is to deeply understand the customer, deeply understand who your customer is going to have to become in order for you to displace the thing that's already there. And I included the kind of analogy of, looking at power sockets around the world. If we decided tomorrow that there was a better power socket, the idea of just replacing the world's power sockets would be considerable, but unlikely to happen. And actually, that's the way a lot of pharmaceuticals tend to get launched. Is go, look, this one's definitely better. It's more efficient. It's less likely to blow up or whatever. Ignoring the installed user base. And if you ignore that installed user base, you're missing some of the lessons of deep product development and deep positioning. That's clearly important. The other phase transition, I think, is the one that tends to kill pharma, which is that we need to understand the incentives that happen around moving from phase 1 to phase 2 and phase 2 to 3 and 3 to approval. The incentives for doing those things tend to reduce the size of the hurdles that we have to jump. and it treats that first hurdle like a high jump that's to be got over instead of a one of 10 that we might need to address on the way through. So thinking about this phase transition, if we want people to move from the way that they prescribe today to a new state, we're going to need to create a product and a set of considerations that make that easier for them to do. And another chapter in the book really focuses on this idea of value, endpoints, and so forth, and it challenges you all to address the word efficacy, because efficacy doesn't mean one thing. You know, here's a chart that shows, for example, what a cancer drug might do reasonably, and none of these are what can be replaced by the word efficacy, but efficacy is all of these things. So I think it's really important that the more we play with what endpoints we might measure, what the value might be of the patient, and so forth, we're into more complexity than we are into simplicity. But that's a good thing. Here's where we might find our differentiation. And the key thing here, if we're focused on deep positioning, is it's a space in the mind of the real mind of the customer, the one that they might not reveal to you in market research, the one that they might not even understand themselves. And to that question about the emotional versus rational customer, we're not just trying to find nice things to say, we're trying to motivate and find something that's memorable and sustainable, unique, and all those other things that we have to find. But if we can find the real customer's motivations and get into that kind of deep psyche, who they are, how they show up, and so forth, we can get to real truths, and they don't show up easily. They're often very simple, but they're often inconvenient. So our task in deep positioning is to understand them as much as possible. I won't dwell on this one too much, because I think we all use the word North Star as if it's interchangeable with a vision for what we're doing, but it becomes very relevant when we're looking at positioning. The definitions here really matter. It's an invariable thing that doesn't move while everything else moves around it. Well, again, you can see if you're doing deep positioning, why having a North Star is really critical. Is what is the market position that we're aiming at, around which everything else can pivot, as long as we begin to collect the data that we were ever planning on collecting. So this is my last slide. I think I'm trying to keep to Theo's time limit. The goal, and some of you will have seen this cartoon in the video that we produced a couple of years ago, the idea is that you end up somewhere different, right? And deep positioning should take all of your colleagues along with you. And I'm going to address Kristen's question here, which was, who are the key decision makers from earliest drug development phase to phase 3? This is really something where we see a team that is matrixed properly becomes super critical to the challenge that you find. If someone's dominant, and we often find a dominant hierarchy in organizations where people don't realize that they've just made a decision that's about to impact everyone down the line. I think the more that organizations are aware of that, and the less they hand this off as a baton pass, the better it can be. So all of the traditional divisions, for as long as they work together and respect each other's role in the process. Ines' question, when's the book available? We're aiming at 12th of December publication. So that one's an easy one to answer. Johanna's question, customers' minds are not always the same, how to select where to focus. So one of the things we need to be mindful of for deep positioning is there is no one customer that we're focused on at that point. Sometimes it's easier to think about which patient types you might go for a particular molecule. But if you have, let's say, an antipsychotic, and your choices are, do we go through schizophrenia, through depression, through bipolar, through some other form of indication, that actually could be easy, because then you say, well, actually, we're just talking to psychiatrists. But of course, you've got different patient groups. But let's say you have an anti-inflammatory where you could end up in cardiovascular or diabetes or Alzheimer's or something else. It's important to not go too deep until you've established what are the choices that of market position that are available to you. Do that well, and then come back and begin to look at what the variables can be in this conversation. I think that's really the focus of this book, is that this is a conversation between a market coming back into clinical development, and the clinical development should be held loosely until that market has had a conversation with it. And the earlier you can have that conversation between a potential market and a potential product, the better this can become. And if I've got one more question. Is positioning only relevant to pharmaceuticals? No, I mean, actually the idea of deep positioning is relevant to every industry, and it kind of borrows from some other industries too. The great positionings you'd include, I mean, some of the ones we've done, I think some like Cymbalta or Avastin, but I think one of the best ever is Lipitor. We've actually got a list of what we think are the best positionings on our website. Can a drug succeed without great positioning? So we saw recently one of the most successful drugs that's out there at the moment. We saw its positioning statement, and it's terrible. It's just a dreadful positioning statement. But it's one of the most successful drugs out there. So what it tells you is the deep positioning of that drug, actually, that it was tumor agnostic, was going to go broad, it was going to go for, combinability. That's a positioning. That's deep positioning, rather than the brand positioning, which actually is dreadful in their case. So yes, drugs can succeed without good brand positioning. I think we haven't ever seen a drug succeed without great deep positioning. And I think that's where the two things become, extremely valuable. But Theo, I'm aware that I've gone up against the 30-minute deadline. Should I stop, or?
We can keep going. We don't get kicked off the platform, and everything's recorded. So if any of our guests need to jump off, we'll send them the recording. But I think we should keep going while we've got stuff to get through.
Okay. I'm through all of my slides. So if someone wants to quickly drop a question in the chat, maybe let's give it 5 more minutes and I can cover anything that's there. But no, I think some of these questions I kind of address pretty quickly. Yeah, the decision maker one is critical. I think one of the things the book addresses is what do we mean by a decision to develop against an opportunity, because actually the decision to go to phase 3 isn't the same decision as the decision to explore opportunity earlier. And I think breaking down what decision gateways look like is really important there as well. Understanding what we might develop, why we might develop it, what the opportunity becomes, as I address in this idea of, what's the opportunity in forecasting, as well as forecasting opportunity is to do it with much more complexity and opportunity sort of focus. So yeah, that's part of that. 3 forces: scientific theory, medical practice, product characteristics. The deep positioning approach to that essentially says, well, look, we tend to talk, and the book addresses this idea of mechanism of action, mechanism of effect, which is how is the drug having an effect in the disease. It also talks about the mechanism of value. And I think actually what we can do is we start to look through some of the kind of breakdown of endpoints and the way the drug works is we can craft new ways of describing a class. We can craft new ways of describing a product. So the scientific theory people talk about as if it's fixed, it typically isn't. It's why we suggest that the kind of scientific platform should come after the deep positioning, because actually then you're explaining how the drug's doing what you want it to do rather than just what it does academically. Medical practice, understanding what your customers actually do versus what they say they do is really important as well, because when they're given a market research survey, they tend to give you the right answer rather than the answer that's true. And the product characteristics are a variable, right? So I mean, the molecule will do what the molecule does, but it has a different opportunity if you've looked at the dose and the product and the delivery and the posology and so forth differently. So the idea of deep positioning is to understand the place in the market that all of those things could reach their apogee, their kind of perfect spot, and then come back and make sure that happens in development. The risk is that you assume that science, if you follow the science, will naturally lead to an endpoint. But as you saw with the checkpoint inhibitors, that's not true. Your ability to collect evidence next to an indication and being first versus second is going to make a very big difference to that. To Nicholas's point, which I think probably will be the last question, work with drugs and delivery platforms. Yeah, absolutely. To be honest, Nicholas, all drugs have delivery platforms, always have had. I think it's you've added to the question. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so all drugs have had a delivery platform. It's just that we've tended to assume it's oral versus IV versus subcutaneous. None of those things actually describe very well, apart from intravenous, how the drug works, right? Oral drugs don't all work the same way. Sub-Q drugs, some of them are transdermal and so forth. So recognizing that the delivery solution, and that could be, you've gone, deeply nanoformed the product, or you've done some other clever thing to it. How you get drugs into to a receptor, how you get them to the place of effect is a choice, and those choices should reflect your understanding of the customer and the market opportunity. It doesn't always, but I think the more that you can focus on some of those adjacencies to pharmaceutical molecule development, the better everyone's life becomes from that point onwards. The risk is that you try and do it too late, and then it's really hard to try and fit that into a treatment landscape. But certainly, it's a fundamental part of deep positioning. So, I am gonna hand back to Theo. Look out on December the 12th for the book. If you've seen the blog, you've probably seen some of the ideas coming up as the chapters have been written. But we're excited to get this out there and try and get pharma to lean into this idea of getting it right earlier rather than waiting to wrap it later.
Nice one. Thank you, Mike. And thanks everyone for joining. If anyone had a question they didn't get to ask, feel free to shoot me an email. And yeah, we'll be sharing the recording of this, and stay tuned for the book launch in just over a couple of weeks' time. Thanks, Mike. Have a good day, everyone.